Concentrate. Imagine it's like breathing for you.
I didn't know what it was.
You know all the fool that I took you for. It's so trash. There's the song today. That was quick. In my heart, I knew you still cared. Now, reality.
You let her go!
Ah, the boyfriend.
I'm gonna blow that nutsack of a chin right off your face.
Not him.
Do it!
I told you to go. I like it.
Satellite.
Stolen Quinjet, four of the world's most wanted criminals.
You know they're only criminals because you've chosen to call them that, right, sir?
I'm pretty sure I paid for that. You have second thoughts?
Not anymore.
Mr. Secretary, I'm not looking for forgiveness, and I'm way past asking permission. Earth.
It's a court martial. Great to see you.
You too, buddy.
I think you're great.
This is
It's your top of my family.
Avengers: Infinity War begins from a position most superhero movies spend their entire running time trying to prevent. The heroes are already late. Before the film has properly gathered its enormous cast, before the familiar teams can settle into their usual rhythms, the story establishes a world in which power has arrived faster than preparation. That choice matters because Infinity War is not really structured around the question of whether powerful people can win. It is structured around what happens when power is no longer enough. That is the deeper view Cinema Deep View is taking into Avengers, Infinity War, released in 2018. On the surface, this is the grand convergence promised by years of interconnected Marvel storytelling. Characters from separate franchises finally occupy the same crisis. Different tones, relationships, and histories are forced into one enormous narrative machine. Yet beneath that scale, the movie keeps returning to something much smaller and more uncomfortable, what each character believes they are willing to lose. That gives us the guiding question for this film. Why does Avengers, Infinity War feel less like a victory lap for its heroes and more like a collision between competing definitions of sacrifice? The obvious answer might seem to be Thanos. He enters the story with a goal vast enough to reorganize the entire universe, and his pursuit of the Infinity Stones gives the movie its external momentum. But scale alone does not explain the tension. Plenty of blockbusters threaten worlds. Infinity War creates its particular pressure by repeatedly placing characters in situations where the emotionally correct choice and the strategically useful choice do not comfortably align. That distinction changes how the movie feels. The heroes are not simply divided by location. They are divided by instinct. Some believe saving one person is worth risking everything. Others think responsibility may require accepting an unbearable loss. Some react through loyalty, some through guilt, some through duty, and some through a confidence that borders on denial. The film keeps moving these attitudes into contact with one another, almost as if every confrontation is testing a different answer to the same moral problem. This is why the huge cast rarely feels like the movie's only point. The spectacle is enormous, but the dramatic engine is often intimate. A conversation about trust can matter as much as a battle. A hesitation can reveal more than a display of strength. A character's refusal to let go can become both an expression of love and a strategic weakness. Infinity War repeatedly turns emotional commitment into pressure. It also gives its antagonist an unusual structural advantage. Thanos is not simply waiting at the end of the story for the heroes to reach him. His movement determines the shape of the film. He has direction. He has a belief system. Most importantly, he behaves as though the price of his goal has already been accepted. The heroes, by contrast, are still deciding what prices they can live with. That creates a strange imbalance. The people we expect to control the story often spend it reacting, improvising, separating, reconnecting, and trying to understand the scale of what is coming. Their strength is unquestionable, their unity is not. And that is where Infinity War begins to become more interesting than its crossover premise suggests. The central conflict is not only between heroes and villain, it is between different ideas of responsibility. Is sacrifice meaningful because you choose to make it yourself? Can you call something sacrifice when someone else pays the cost? Does refusing to lose someone make you morally stronger, or can love become a form of blindness when the stakes grow large enough? The movie does not answer those questions immediately. It distributes them across characters, relationships, and choices, letting different parts of the story argue with one another. So before looking closely at plot mechanics, performances, visual design, or the ending, we first need to establish what kind of experience Infinity War actually offers. Because for all its scale, its first impression is surprisingly specific. This is a superhero epic built around people discovering that having the power to act is not the same as knowing what the right action is. Infinity War presents itself as a superhero crossover. But the experience is closer to a pressure chamber. The attraction is obviously scale. Iron Man, Doctor Strange, Thor, the Guardians of the Galaxy, Spider-Man, Captain America, Black Panther, and several other established characters are pushed into the same conflict. Yet the movie rarely behaves as though simply placing recognizable heroes beside one another is enough. Its strongest instinct is to immediately give those combinations a problem. That makes the film feel surprisingly restless. There is almost no comfortable center where everyone can gather, exchange information, and form one clean plan. The story keeps breaking into smaller groups, each operating with incomplete knowledge. One team understands part of the threat, another knows something different. Several characters believe they are facing the most urgent version of the problem, and the movie allows all of them to be partly right. This fragmentation is one of Infinity War's greatest strengths. A conventional ensemble film can lose momentum when it keeps switching between characters. Here, the movement between locations becomes part of the suspense. Each group carries a different emotional temperature. Tony Stark's material has nervous intellectual friction. Thor's journey carries grief beneath its humor. The Guardians bring comic unpredictability, but their encounters gradually become more serious. The Wakanda material eventually turns the crisis into organized defense. These tones are not perfectly seamless, yet they create contrast rather than simple repetition. The film also understands that audiences arrive with expectations built over many previous Marvel stories. Normally, that history would give the heroes security. We know their abilities, friendships, habits, and survival instincts. Infinity War uses that familiarity against us. Because we already understand how these people usually function, their lack of control becomes more noticeable. Tony is accustomed to solving problems by thinking faster than the situation around him. Doctor Strange is accustomed to possessing knowledge that other people lack. Thor normally meets catastrophe by moving toward it with physical certainty. Peter Parker believes that helping is almost automatically the right decision. Steve Rogers approaches danger with an intense commitment to protecting individuals. None of those qualities disappear. The film simply creates a crisis large enough that each strength can become a limitation. That is where the movie's most effective tension comes from. The heroes are not suddenly incompetent. Their established virtues stop producing reliable outcomes. The immediate standout, though, is the film's sense of forward motion. Thanos does not feel like an obstacle waiting for the protagonists to activate him. His objective is already underway. The heroes enter a story that another character appears to have begun earlier. That structural decision gives Infinity War an unusual urgency. Every delay feels costly because the antagonist is continuously advancing. It also changes the function of exposition. The Infinity Stones, their locations, and their significance could easily turn the movie into a long explanation of franchise mythology. Instead, most of that information is tied to immediate decisions. Knowledge matters because somebody must protect something, surrender something, destroy something, or reach somewhere before someone else does. The mythology becomes dramatic when it creates choices. That does not mean the film escapes the problems of its size. The first meaningful reservation is that emotional depth is distributed unevenly. Some characters receive scenes that expose fear, grief, loyalty, or contradiction. Others are primarily needed to keep the machinery moving. With so many personalities sharing limited space, not every relationship can develop beyond what previous films already established. Infinity War often depends on the audience bringing emotional memory into the theater with them. That dependence is both efficient and limiting. If you already understand why certain relationships matter, a short exchange can carry years of accumulated meaning. If you do not, the same moment may feel dramatically compressed. The film is therefore unusually dependent on franchise literacy. It makes a serious effort to remain understandable as an immediate conflict, but its emotional architecture assumes familiarity. There is also a tonal risk. Humor is deeply embedded in the Marvel style, and Infinity War continues using it even while the threat becomes increasingly severe. Much of that comedy works because the character pairings are genuinely funny. Tony and Strange compete for control. Thor's seriousness clashes with the Guardians' behavior. Peter's nervous energy creates relief around characters carrying heavier responsibilities. Still, the film occasionally moves from tension into comedy so quickly that an emotional moment loses a little of its weight. The problem is not that a dark story must remain solemn. Contrast can make drama stronger. The question is whether every joke arrives because the character would naturally make it, or because the larger franchise rhythm expects one. For viewers who enjoy ensemble storytelling, competing personalities, large-scale action, and stories where familiar heroes are denied their usual control, Infinity War offers one of the more ambitious experiences in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Someone looking for a self-contained drama with equal attention given to every character may find the architecture more frustrating. This is deliberately a convergence point, and the film uses accumulated history as part of its storytelling vocabulary. Its greatest early success is therefore not spectacle by itself. It is momentum created by imbalance. Thanos knows what he wants. He knows where he needs to go. He believes he understands what the cost will be. Almost everyone opposing him is still trying to coordinate knowledge, loyalty, fear, and responsibility while the situation keeps changing. That imbalance gives the story its engine. Infinity War moves because one side acts with frightening clarity, while the other side keeps discovering that saving everyone may require choices its heroes have spent years refusing to make. The story engine of Infinity War belongs to the character the Avengers are trying to stop. That sounds backwards for a superhero film, but it explains much of the movie's unusual momentum. Thanos has the clearest objective: acquire all 6 Infinity Stones and use their combined power to impose his idea of balance across the universe. The Avengers and their allies are therefore not beginning a mission of their own. They are entering different stages of his mission and trying to interrupt it before he reaches the end. This gives the screenplay an immediate advantage. It does not need to manufacture a new reason for the story to move every 20 minutes. The same threat keeps changing shape. One stone means one location, one group of characters, and one kind of problem. Move to another stone, and the film can change setting, tone, and character combination without abandoning its central line of cause and effect. The stones are essentially structural pressure points. More importantly, each one forces the heroes to confront a slightly different version of possession. Doctor Strange carries responsibility for the Time Stone. Vision's existence is inseparable from the Mind Stone. Other stones are already in Thanos' path before many of the Earthbound heroes even understand how advanced his campaign has become. What looks like a cosmic treasure hunt from a distance becomes, at character level, a series of questions about what someone is responsible for protecting and what they might eventually be asked to surrender. Marvel's own character material confirms that protecting the Time Stone shapes Strange's decisions, while removing Vision's Mind Stone without killing him becomes a central problem that sends the heroes toward Wakanda. That is the causal mechanism beneath all the spectacle. Tony Stark's side of the story begins with information arriving faster than he can comfortably process it. Bruce Banner returns carrying the warning of a threat that exceeds the scale of the conflicts Earth has recently survived. Doctor Strange and Wong understand the importance of the stones from another angle. Their interests overlap, but their personalities do not. That friction matters because the movie refuses to give us a clean chain of command. Tony wants to solve the crisis through initiative. Strange is responsible for something larger than Tony's immediate priorities and will not simply surrender control to him. Peter Parker enters from an entirely different emotional position. He sees danger and moves toward it because helping is fundamental to his identity, even though the adults around him understand more clearly what the consequences could become. Put those 3 personalities together, and the plot gains propulsion from disagreement as much as cooperation. There is also unfinished history hanging over Tony. The Avengers are no longer functioning as one intact unit. The fracture created before Infinity War has practical consequences now. The exact details do not need to be constantly explained because the important point is visible in the present. When the largest threat yet appears, some of Earth's strongest defenders are not in the same room, following the same plan, or even communicating comfortably. The franchise history stops being background continuity and becomes an obstacle. That is a useful piece of screenwriting economy. Instead of treating earlier films as references to reward longtime viewers, Infinity War turns accumulated decisions into current limitations. Previous victories did not reset the board, relationships remained damaged, trust remained complicated. The result is that Thanos attacks a universe whose defenders possess extraordinary power but imperfect coordination. Bruce Banner becomes one of the clearest carriers of that problem. He knows enough to understand the threat, but knowledge does not translate into complete control over what he can contribute. His usual relationship with the Hulk becomes unreliable at exactly the moment brute force would appear most useful. Again, the pattern is the same. A familiar strength develops a complication. Thor's trajectory takes the idea in another direction. His response to catastrophe is not withdrawal, it is purpose intensified into obsession. When he encounters the Guardians of the Galaxy, the film briefly allows two very different corners of the Marvel Universe to collide through comedy. Yet the combination serves a larger structural purpose. Thor gains transportation, information, and potential allies, while the Guardians gain direct contact with a conflict that is deeply personal for some of them. The movie is constantly merging plot lines this way. Characters rarely meet because the screenplay simply wants a crossover moment. Ideally, they meet because each possesses something the other side needs: knowledge, transportation, power, access, emotional history, or a route toward Thanos. That functional logic keeps the cast from feeling completely arbitrary. The Guardians also reveal another important feature of the story engine. Thanos is not an abstract invader to everyone. For Gamora, the conflict carries personal history. She understands his mentality in a way most of the heroes cannot. That knowledge is valuable, but it also makes her vulnerable to a pressure the others do not share. Peter Quill's relationship with her then transforms her history with Thanos into something that affects his own choices. Infinity War repeatedly links information to emotion like this. Knowing more does not necessarily make a character safer. Sometimes knowledge creates the exact decision that becomes hardest to make. Meanwhile, Steve Rogers and the heroes operating with him enter the larger conflict through Vision and Wanda. Their part of the story initially feels smaller and more protective. The problem is concentrated in one person. Vision possesses something Thanos needs, which means keeping him alive and preventing the stone from being taken become intertwined objectives. Strategically, there is an obvious brutal simplicity available to the heroes. If an object is dangerous enough in enemy hands, destroying it before the enemy reaches it may seem logical. Emotionally, the situation is completely different because the object is part of a living person. That is where Infinity War's plot mechanics begin exposing its central idea. The film repeatedly makes the efficient choice emotionally unacceptable. Steve's instinct is crucial. His concept of heroism resists treating an individual as expendable simply because the calculation becomes inconvenient. That principle is admirable. It is also exactly the kind of principle this story is designed to place under maximum pressure. So the heroes search for another possibility. Wakanda provides one because its technology creates hope that Vision and the Mind Stone can be separated without automatically sacrificing him. The move toward Wakanda, therefore, does more than establish another large battlefield. It represents the hero's preferred moral solution: reject the binary choice, protect the person, preserve the larger mission, and find a third option. That impulse appears throughout the film. These characters have spent years surviving impossible situations by finding alternatives. Of course, they believe another solution exists. Superhero storytelling has trained both them and the audience to expect ingenuity at the point where sacrifice appears unavoidable. Infinity War understands that expectation and builds suspense by making time itself the enemy of compromise. Every alternative requires minutes, every rescue requires movement, every argument costs attention, every attempt to save both the individual and the universe gives Thanos more room to advance. This is why the screenplay's fragmented structure works better than it initially seems it should. The separate groups are not merely completing unrelated missions before meeting for a finale. They are racing different versions of the same clock. Tony, Strange, Peter, and their eventual allies are pulled increasingly close to Thanos himself. Thor pursues greater capability because he concludes that meeting Thanos again without changing the balance of power would simply repeat failure. Steve's group protects Vision while trying to preserve an option that does not demand an immediate human cost. Each path is therefore an answer to helplessness. Tony answers helplessness with strategy and confrontation. Thor answers it by seeking enough power to make the next confrontation different. Steve answers it through refusal. The crisis does not receive permission to redefine one life as disposable. And Thanos answers helplessness with control so absolute that he has convinced himself mass suffering becomes morality when attached to a sufficiently large objective. That final distinction is essential. On the surface, both Thanos and the heroes talk through the language of sacrifice. The difference is who receives the authority to decide the sacrifice and who actually pays for it. A hero may choose to risk himself. That is sacrifice in the traditional heroic sense. Thanos operates through another logic entirely. He appoints himself the person who determines what everyone else must lose. His certainty removes consent from the equation, then disguises domination as necessity. The screenplay makes him dangerous not merely because he is strong enough to defeat powerful opponents. He is dangerous because his belief system eliminates hesitation. The heroes hesitate because they care about consequences. Thanos interprets the absence of hesitation as proof of conviction, and this creates the most important imbalance in the entire narrative engine. The heroes keep searching for ways to reduce the cost. Thanos has already decided that enormous cost validates the mission rather than discredits it. That is why Infinity War can move between planets, cities, relationships, jokes, battles, and arguments without entirely losing its center. Beneath all those locations is one repeating dramatic mechanism. Something valuable is threatened. A character searches for a way to protect it without abandoning the larger fight. Time narrows. The apparently impossible choice gets closer. The question is no longer simply whether the Avengers are powerful enough to stop Thanos. The story has already made clear that strength exists on every side. The more revealing question is what happens to each character when strength cannot remove the cost of choosing. That is the pressure Infinity War is building toward, and it is under pressure that these heroes begin to show us what their principles actually mean. Infinity War becomes most revealing when its characters stop being defined by what they can do and start being defined by what they refuse to do. That distinction begins with Tony Stark. His visible goal is straightforward: stop Thanos before the threat reaches its final form. Beneath that objective, though, Tony is still carrying a deeper need for control. He has spent years responding to fear by building systems, armor, plans, alliances, and contingencies. When something frightens him, his instinct is rarely to step away. It is to prepare harder. Thanos is therefore almost perfectly designed to expose Tony's weakness. Tony can understand machinery. He can improvise around physical obstacles. He can calculate faster than most people around him. What he cannot easily tolerate is a situation where preparation does not guarantee influence over the outcome. Robert Downey Jr. communicates that pressure without needing Tony to become dramatically different from the character we already know. His speed of speech remains, his sarcasm remains, his intelligence remains, but underneath those familiar behaviors there is less ease. He often seems to be thinking several moves ahead while simultaneously realizing that the board may be larger than anything he has planned for. His friction with Doctor Strange makes that especially visible. Strange does not automatically accept Tony's authority, and Tony does not automatically trust Strange's priorities. They are similar enough to irritate one another. Both are highly intelligent. Both are accustomed to being the most informed person in a room. Both can be arrogant when certainty feels justified, yet the source of their responsibility is different. Tony thinks like an engineer facing an escalating emergency. Strange thinks like a guardian responsible for something whose consequences extend far beyond one battlefield. Benedict Cumberbatch plays that difference through restraint. Strange rarely needs to match Tony's verbal energy. His confidence often appears through stillness, clipped responses, and the sense that he is evaluating possibilities other characters cannot see. That composure creates pressure because Tony's preferred form of leadership depends partly on being able to move everyone toward his solution. Strange will not simply be moved. Peter Parker reveals another side of Tony entirely. Peter's visible motivation is to help. His deeper need is recognition mixed with responsibility. He wants to prove that his abilities mean he should be present when serious things happen. Yet his relationship with Tony also places Tony in a role he is not entirely comfortable occupying: protector. Tom Holland's performance makes Peter's courage feel inseparable from youth. His reactions remain quick, curious, occasionally overwhelmed, and intensely sincere. He does not approach cosmic danger with the emotional distance of someone who has accepted this as routine. That makes him useful to the film because his presence restores scale. When older heroes discuss impossible threats as strategic problems, Peter's expressions remind us that these events should feel enormous. For Tony, that creates a contradiction. he needs capable allies. He also does not want Peter paying the price of a war Peter barely understands. The more dangerous the situation becomes, the harder it is for Tony to maintain both positions at once. Thor is pressured from another direction. By the time his path intersects with the Guardians, his visible goal has become retaliation and renewed strength. But underneath that determination lies accumulated grief. Chris Hemsworth plays Thor with a useful instability between humor and emotional exhaustion. The comedy does not erase what has happened to him. In some moments it almost functions as a surface stretched over it. Thor can remain charismatic, confident, even funny, while the film quietly makes clear that loss has reduced his world again and again. His answer to that loss is action. He does not sit with helplessness, he converts it into a task. That is why his journey toward greater power matters beyond simple escalation. Thor is trying to make sure that the next time he faces Thanos, he will not be powerless. The logic is understandable. It is also dangerous because it narrows his emotional world into a single objective. Grief becomes direction. Rocket recognizes more of this than his behavior initially suggests. The relationship between Thor and Rocket works because neither character treats vulnerability in a conventional way. Rocket often hides concern beneath sarcasm and practical thinking. Thor hides pain beneath confidence and purpose. Their scenes create pressure by allowing those defenses to briefly become visible without turning the exchange into sentimental confession. Then there is Gamora. Her pressure is more personal than almost anyone else's because Thanos is not merely an enemy approaching from outside. He is part of the history she has spent trying to escape. Zoe Saldana gives Gamora a guarded quality that becomes essential here. Her knowledge of Thanos is strategic, but it is also emotional knowledge. She understands what his certainty can justify. She understands how he converts control into a language of purpose. That makes her one of the people best equipped to recognize the danger, while also making the conflict uniquely difficult for her to separate from her past. Peter Quill becomes the relationship that exposes her most clearly. Their connection introduces tenderness into a part of the story built around fear. It also creates another version of the film's central dilemma. Love offers emotional strength, but love can also create impossible obligations. Chris Pratt's performance is most effective when Quill's usual comic confidence begins to fail him. The character often operates through charm, improvisation, and emotional impulsiveness. Infinity War gradually asks what happens when those qualities meet a situation that cannot be joked away or easily reversed. The answer is uncomfortable because the movie does not treat emotion as automatically noble. Feeling deeply can lead to courage. It can also make strategic judgment harder. Wanda and Vision carry the most concentrated version of that conflict. Vision's visible goal is survival, but his less visible need is almost the opposite. He wants his existence to mean more than the object inside him. The Mind Stone makes him strategically important, yet his relationship with Wanda gives him a private identity beyond his usefulness to either side. Paul Bettany's performance emphasizes calm even when the situation becomes increasingly frightening. Vision often seems to approach the crisis by reasoning toward what responsibility might require. That makes his willingness to consider personal cost believable. Wanda resists that logic because for her, Vision is not a strategic asset. He is someone she loves. Elizabeth Olsen communicates the conflict through hesitation and attention. Wanda's power is immense, but her strongest scenes here are not about force. They are about the emotional difficulty of being asked to treat someone intimate as part of a calculation. Steve Rogers places himself firmly on her side of that argument. His visible goal is to protect Vision while stopping Thanos. His deeper need is consistency, with the moral identity he has built around refusing to abandon individuals, simply because institutions or circumstances declare them expendable. Chris Evans plays Steve with less uncertainty than several of the other heroes, but that does not mean the character is under less pressure. His tension comes from the possibility that a virtue can become strategically costly. Steve's belief is admirable because it insists that saving the world cannot become an excuse for casually deciding whose life counts less. Infinity War tests that belief by making the stakes almost impossibly large. That is the important distinction. The movie does not need Steve to be wrong in order to challenge him. It only needs to ask whether a moral principle remains uncomplicated when millions of lives may depend on violating it. Black Panther and the Wakandan forces then widen the pressure from personal choice into collective responsibility. Wakanda becomes the place where the heroes try to protect one life without abandoning everyone else. The nation is not merely offering technology. It is accepting risk created by a global and cosmic conflict. Chadwick Boseman gives T'Challa an economy that suits this role. His leadership is conveyed through decisions rather than extended explanation. He understands that helping Vision places Wakanda directly in danger, but leadership for him is not framed as safety at any cost. Across all these characters, one pattern keeps returning. The heroes feel pressure because they recognize other people as people. That sounds obvious, yet it is exactly what separates them from Thanos. Josh Brolin's performance gives Thanos a disturbing calm because the character rarely behaves as though he is confused about his own morality. He has converted conviction into insulation. Once he labels suffering necessary, he no longer needs to reconsider the people experiencing it. His strength is therefore not simply physical, it is psychological certainty. The heroes hesitate, argue, grieve, improvise, protect, and sometimes make emotional mistakes because they remain connected to individual lives. Thanos interprets that attachment as weakness. Infinity War keeps asking whether he is strategically correct while making clear how morally corrupted that calculation becomes. And that brings the pressure map back to the central argument. Tony wants control. Thor wants enough strength to reverse helplessness. Gamora wants freedom from the person who shaped her through domination. Quill wants love to survive the impossible demand placed upon it. Wanda wants to protect the person hidden inside a cosmic problem. Vision is prepared to consider sacrifice. Steve refuses to let necessity become an excuse for surrendering someone too quickly. Thanos believes sacrifice proves commitment even when he appoints himself to decide who pays. The film's characters are therefore not separated only by power levels, locations, or alliances. They are separated by what pressure persuades them to protect, surrender, control, or destroy. And once those choices are placed beside one another, Infinity War begins to reveal the deeper thread beneath its superhero machinery. The difference between accepting a cost yourself and claiming the right to impose that cost on everybody else, on the surface. Infinity War is about stopping Thanos from collecting the Infinity Stones. Beneath that pursuit, the film keeps circling a more difficult idea: whether love remains moral when protecting someone you love may endanger people you will never meet. That tension runs through almost every major relationship. The heroes repeatedly face situations in which attachment interferes with efficiency. From a purely strategic perspective, the universe would be easier to defend if every character could detach from individual lives and think only in numbers. But Infinity War understands that this would also erase the quality that makes these characters heroic in the first place. They care specifically, not about humanity as an abstraction, but about particular people. Steve does not see Vision as a container for the Mind Stone. Wanda does not see him as a tactical problem. Peter Quill does not see Gamora as acceptable collateral. Tony does not see Peter Parker as another useful soldier. Thor's grief is not a statistical response to destruction. These relationships make the universe matter because they scale back into individuals. Thanos approaches the same problem from the opposite direction. His entire worldview depends on abstraction. He sees populations before people. He speaks through ratios, balance, resources, and necessity. Once life becomes a number, enormous suffering can be reorganized into a calculation. The personal disappears beneath the theoretical. That makes the conflict deeper than heroism versus villainy. It becomes intimacy versus abstraction. The film repeatedly asks what happens when someone who thinks in individuals confronts someone who thinks in totals. That is why sacrifice becomes such an important recurring pattern. Sacrifice is usually treated in heroic storytelling as proof of moral seriousness. A character gives up something valuable for the sake of others. Infinity War complicates that concept by presenting several different actions that could all be described with the same word while carrying very different moral meanings. Vision is willing to consider losing his own life to prevent catastrophe. That is voluntary. Wanda may be asked to participate in that loss. That is emotionally devastating precisely because she recognizes him as more than the strategic value of the stone. Steve resists the entire premise that saving the universe should automatically require giving up one person. Then Thanos enters the same thematic territory while changing its meaning completely. He also believes great goals require great costs, but there is a fundamental difference between surrendering something of your own and declaring that somebody else must be surrendered. Infinity War builds much of its moral architecture inside that distinction. Thanos wants the language of sacrifice without accepting the limitation that true sacrifice places on the person making it. His conviction allows him to present domination as responsibility. If suffering advances his objective, then the suffering becomes evidence of seriousness rather than evidence that the objective itself should be reconsidered. The heroes are messier because they cannot detach so easily. Their choices contain contradiction. Steve's refusal to sacrifice Vision is humane, but it creates risk. Wanda's love gives Vision's life meaning, but it makes the possibility of losing him almost unbearable. Quill's emotional attachment makes him capable of extraordinary loyalty, but emotion can also destabilize judgment. Tony's desire to protect Peter is admirable, even while Tony himself continues deeper into danger. Thor's grief gives him purpose while also narrowing that purpose toward retaliation. None of these contradictions make the characters hypocritical, they make the theme more interesting. Infinity War is not arguing that emotion is a mistake, it is asking what moral action looks like when emotion and responsibility point in different directions. A recurring spatial pattern reinforces this idea. Characters spend much of the film separated. The Avengers are fragmented before Thanos fully arrives. Tony and Steve remain apart. Thor travels on his own path. The Guardians are divided by different responsibilities. Wanda and Vision begin by trying to preserve a private space away from larger obligations. Then the threat keeps collapsing those spaces. Private relationships become cosmic decisions. A quiet attempt at normality becomes impossible because Vision carries something the enemy needs. Gamora's past becomes important to everyone because she knows Thanos. Peter's desire to help takes him far beyond the environment Tony wants him in. Thor's personal grief becomes connected to the survival of countless strangers. The movie continually expands the radius of consequence around intimate relationships. That expansion gives the Infinity Stones a second function. They are not only powerful objects, they connect private bodies to universal stakes. Vision embodies this most clearly. The Mind Stone is simultaneously an artifact of enormous strategic importance and part of his physical existence. The film makes it impossible to separate the cosmic problem from the individual person without confronting the moral cost. This is one reason the attempt to remove the stone matters thematically. The heroes are not simply searching for a technical solution. They are defending the possibility that the universe does not have to operate according to Thanos' binary logic. He says necessity demands sacrifice. They keep searching for another answer. That search is fundamentally hopeful. It may also be dangerously optimistic. Infinity War leaves that ambiguity alive rather than resolving it immediately. The hero's refusal to accept the cruelest option can be read as moral courage. It can also be read as the consequence of believing that there will always be enough time to invent a better solution. Superhero stories frequently reward that belief. A third path appears. A last-second rescue works. An impossible plan succeeds because courage, intelligence, teamwork, or sheer determination creates another option. Infinity War knows its audience has learned that rhythm. So when the characters reject terrible choices, we are inclined to support them. We have years of genre conditioning telling us that heroism means refusing false choices. Save the world or save the person. A superhero story often answers, find a way to save both. Infinity War turns that expectation into pressure. The closer Thanos gets, the less time remains for third options. That gives time an almost moral function in the film. Every delay preserves one value while threatening another. Every attempt to protect someone consumes an opportunity elsewhere. The story keeps forcing admirable instincts into competition. Control is another supporting thread. Tony tries to manage uncertainty. Strange tries to protect the larger order. Steve rejects institutions that demand obedience without moral trust. Thanos represents control pushed to its most extreme form, one individual granting himself authority over existence itself. The difference is not simply that Thanos wants more power. He wants a universe that cannot refuse his conclusion. That is why his calmness is so unsettling. He does not experience other people's disagreement as morally significant. Their resistance merely confirms in his mind that they cannot see what he sees. His certainty closes the conversation. The heroes, by contrast, spend the film arguing. They disagree about plans, priorities, risks, and responsibilities. At times, that disagreement is inefficient, yet the film also suggests that uncertainty may be evidence of conscience. To hesitate before sacrificing someone is not necessarily weakness. To question whether you have the right to make an irreversible decision for others may be the beginning of morality. Thanos has removed that hesitation from himself. That is precisely what makes him efficient, and precisely what makes him terrifying. This is where the guiding question begins to sharpen. Infinity War does not feel like a victory lap because almost every heroic virtue is placed in a situation where it can generate pain. Love makes people vulnerable. Loyalty complicates strategy. Hope consumes time. Confidence can become blindness. Grief can become obsession. Refusing sacrifice can increase risk. Accepting sacrifice can become dangerously close to adopting the antagonist's logic. The film does not resolve these contradictions by announcing one universal rule. Instead, it places them beside one another and allows the differences to accumulate. One interpretation is that Infinity War is warning against emotional attachment when stakes become large enough. Another is almost the opposite. Perhaps the film is showing that attachment is the only reason saving the universe has meaning at all. If individual lives become interchangeable numbers, then the heroes may defeat Thanos physically while accepting the philosophical premise that allowed him to justify himself. That is the productive ambiguity at the heart of the movie. The heroes need to become more strategically effective without becoming emotionally indifferent. They need to recognize enormous stakes without allowing scale to erase the person directly in front of them. And the film keeps making that balance harder. This is why the most revealing moments are not always the largest battles. Sometimes the central conflict is contained in the space between two people who know what might be required and cannot accept it yet. To see how Infinity War turns that moral tension into actual cinematic form, the next step is to narrow the frame and look closely at the scenes where staging, editing, sound, performance, and withheld information make these ideas visible before any character needs to explain them. Infinity War becomes easier to understand when we stop looking at its battles as demonstrations of power and start looking at where the film places people inside those battles. Consider the early confrontation in New York. The setting is immediately useful because the movie takes cosmic danger and drops it into ordinary urban space. Streets, buildings, traffic, civilians, and familiar architecture create a visual scale against which the threat can be measured. The characters may understand magic, advanced technology, and alien invasion, but the environment around them still looks recognizably human. That contrast keeps the sequence from becoming abstract. Tony Stark and Doctor Strange occupy the same physical space, yet the staging constantly reminds us that they are not functioning as a unified team. Their abilities are different, their instincts are different, and even the way they position themselves communicates competing forms of control. Tony's movement is reactive and technological. His armor allows his body to answer threats almost immediately. Strange's movements are more deliberate. He changes space rather than merely moving through it. The film does not need a long argument about whose method is superior because the action itself establishes the difference. One character responds by building solutions around his body. The other responds by changing the conditions around the threat. Peter Parker then enters with another rhythm entirely. His movement is faster, younger, more improvisational. Peter reacts before he has completely understood the situation, which is both a strength and a warning. His physical confidence says he belongs in the fight. His emotional reactions remind us that he has entered something much larger than the neighborhood-level responsibility that originally shaped his heroism. That difference in scale matters. The sequence keeps pushing him upward, outward, and eventually away from the familiar environment where his instincts were formed. The geography itself becomes part of the character arc. The farther Peter moves from home, the less control Tony has over the consequences of allowing him to participate. The filmmaking turns distance into responsibility. Another revealing scene arrives when Thor encounters the Guardians. On paper, this meeting could have existed almost entirely for crossover comedy. The film certainly uses the contrast. Thor arrives carrying the weight of catastrophe, while the Guardians initially process him through their own eccentric group dynamic. But watch how quickly the scene begins shifting its center. Thor's physical presence is treated almost comically at first. Reactions around him exaggerate the difference between this mythic figure and the strange family who has discovered him. The timing allows the audience to enjoy the collision of franchise personalities. Then Hemsworth begins lowering the emotional temperature. Thor does not suddenly become a different character. Instead, the spaces between the jokes become more important. His voice, posture, and increasingly matter-of-fact description of what has happened create a tension between how impressive he appears and how damaged he actually is. That is a crucial piece of performance design. The film could communicate Thor's grief by stripping away all humor. Instead, it allows humor and pain to occupy the same scene. This makes grief feel less like an isolated dramatic mode and more like something the character is carrying while he continues functioning. Rocket becomes particularly important here. The camera does not need to announce that he recognizes something in Thor. The relationship develops through attention. Rocket, one of the characters most likely to deflect serious emotion through jokes or irritation, begins engaging Thor more directly. Their later conversation works because the scene does not overstate its intimacy. Thor describes losses with an almost disturbing composure. Rocket listens. There is no grand visual transformation announcing vulnerability. The emotional effect comes from the mismatch between Thor's confident surface and the accumulating weight of what he is saying. The restraint gives the scene credibility. It also deepens our guiding question. Thor speaks like someone who has already paid an enormous price. That makes his pursuit of Thanos feel different from the choices facing characters who are still being asked what they might lose. Thor is not protecting himself from sacrifice. He is trying to make sacrifice produce an outcome. That distinction becomes important later. A third scene worth examining is the hero's attempt to plan around Vision. Here, the film dramatically reduces its scale. Instead of a giant battlefield, the important element is discussion. Vision's existence has become connected to the larger threat, and the group has to decide how to respond without treating him merely as an object containing something valuable. The staging gives Vision unusual quietness within the group. He is simultaneously the center of the problem and one of the calmest people participating in the conversation. That reversal is significant. Normally, the person whose life is threatened would be expected to argue most strongly for survival. Vision approaches the problem more analytically, while several people around him resist the most direct solution. The scene therefore shifts our identification. We are not simply being asked whether Vision wants to live. We are being asked what the other characters believe they owe him. Steve Rogers becomes especially important because his refusal to casually exchange one life for countless others initially sounds almost impossible to defend mathematically. The film does not frame the moment mathematically, it frames it relationally. Vision is standing there, he can speak. Other characters know him. The theoretical calculation has a face. This is one of Infinity War's simplest visual arguments. Moral arithmetic becomes harder when the person represented by the number is physically present. The decision to seek help in Wakanda is therefore more than plot movement. It is the visual and narrative expression of the hero's belief that another solution should exist. They refuse the closed choice. The film rewards that refusal temporarily by opening another possibility, but it also attaches a ticking clock to it. Removing the stone safely requires time. Thanos' forces are not obligated to provide that time. That conflict between humane intention and limited time is communicated through editing once the Wakanda sequence develops. The film alternates between protected interior space and increasingly exposed exterior space. Inside, specialists are attempting something precise. Outside, an army is preparing for blunt force. One location depends on concentration, the other depends on survival. The editing makes those two forms of action mutually dependent. Every moment gained outside becomes another moment available inside. The battlefield is therefore not just spectacle. Its dramatic purpose is to purchase time for a morally preferable solution. That gives the action a specific emotional logic. When characters fight, they are not merely trying to defeat anonymous opponents. They are holding open the possibility that vision does not have to become the price of victory. Infinity War is strongest when its action scenes contain that kind of secondary meaning. The Titan confrontation provides another example without needing to expose its final consequences yet. The environment is already broken before the heroes begin fighting there. The landscape looks exhausted, which gives the confrontation a different atmosphere from the clean futurism or populated city spaces elsewhere in the film. Thanos belongs visually in that ruin. The heroes do not. That imbalance matters. On Titan, cooperation becomes choreography. Tony, Strange, Peter, Quill, Drax, Mantis, and others possess radically different abilities. The sequence works when those abilities are arranged like parts of a temporary system. One person distracts, another restrains, another changes spatial conditions, another exploits an opening. The pleasure comes from combination rather than individual dominance. For a brief period, the heroes appear to have discovered the answer Infinity War has repeatedly denied them: coordination. The editing reinforces this by allowing actions to connect across characters. Instead of presenting isolated demonstrations of power, the sequence builds chains of cause and effect. A movement by one character makes another character's action possible. For perhaps the clearest moment in the film, cooperation creates leverage against an opponent who has seemed almost structurally unstoppable. And that is exactly why the scene becomes thematically important. The real test is not whether these characters can generate enough force. It is whether they can maintain emotional control long enough for cooperation to remain intact. Infinity War repeatedly designs scenes this way. Physical problems are created so that emotional weaknesses eventually become visible inside them. New York turns conflicting leadership styles into movement. Thor's encounter with the Guardians turns comedy into a doorway toward grief. Vision's situation turns an abstract calculation into an intimate moral decision. Wakanda turns battlefield spectacle into time purchased for compassion. Titan turns teamwork into a test of whether feeling can coexist with strategy. The filmmaking is therefore doing more than illustrating the screenplay. Framing, distance, editing rhythm, performance timing, environmental design, and shifts in scale keep returning us to the same pressure. The characters possess extraordinary abilities. The film keeps asking whether extraordinary ability is enough when the decisive obstacle is not strength, but the emotional meaning attached to the choice that strength is supposed to make. Infinity War works best when its filmmaking departments stop feeling separate. The movie contains enormous visual effects, large action sequences, complicated editing, multiple musical identities, and a cast spread across different locations. Any one of those systems could easily dominate. Instead, the strongest passages are the ones where direction, performance, visual design, sound, and editing all push toward the same emotional result. That convergence is essential because the film has a structural problem built into its premise. Its characters come from movies that were not designed to feel exactly alike. Doctor Strange brings a visual language built around altered space and controlled mysticism. The Guardians arrive with a looser comic rhythm and a more openly musical identity. Wakanda has its own architecture, technology, costume language, and cultural texture. Tony Stark's world has long been associated with responsive machinery and rapid technological improvisation. Thor occupies a scale that can move from personal grief to mythic spectacle within minutes. Infinity War cannot flatten those identities without losing what made the crossover attractive, so the Russo brothers largely take the opposite approach. The film allows the different cinematic languages to survive, then uses editing to place them inside one accelerating structure. That is particularly visible in the way location changes are handled. A cut from one group to another is rarely only a change of scenery. It often changes the emotional pressure. A sequence carrying grief may give way to one driven by strategic argument. A comic interaction may be followed by a moment of threat. A large battle may be interrupted by a smaller conversation whose consequences are more important than the spectacle surrounding it. The editing, therefore, controls exhaustion. With this many characters and this much action, constant maximum intensity would flatten the experience. The movie instead creates waves. Tension rises, releases slightly, changes form, then rises again somewhere else. The advantage is momentum. The limitation is that some emotional moments receive less time than they might have in a smaller film. That trade-off is inseparable from the project. The cinematography also works to preserve character identity within the larger ensemble. Tony's action often emphasizes responsiveness. His technology changes around immediate problems, so the visual presentation favors movement that feels adaptive. Doctor Strange's power is built around geometry, repetition, spatial distortion, and controlled gestures. When Strange is involved, the screen can suddenly become less physically stable. Thor's major moments tend to favor weight. His body, weapons, and movement are often presented with a sense of impact that supports his mythic status. The camera does not need to convince us that every hero is equally powerful in the same way. It gives their power different textures. That difference makes team combinations easier to read. On Titan, especially, the choreography becomes almost grammatical. Characters do not simply attack one after another. Their powers form sentences. Strange alters the conditions of the space. Peter exploits mobility. Tony adapts technology to openings as they appear. Mantis contributes through a completely different kind of vulnerability in the opponent. Quill and Drax bring their own physical and tactical roles. The sequence becomes satisfying because variety turns into coordination. Visual effects are doing enormous work here, but their best contribution is not simply scale, it is legibility. A battle involving portals, advanced armor, alien physiology, web movement, environmental destruction, and multiple characters could become visual noise very quickly. The scene generally remains understandable because actions have relationships. We can follow what one hero is trying to create for another. That is what makes the effects serve drama rather than merely decorate it. The same principle applies to Thanos. His visual construction has to accomplish something more difficult than making him physically convincing. The performance needs to remain visible through the effect. Josh Brolin's work depends heavily on small shifts in expression, pauses, and vocal calm. If the digital character were treated only as an enormous purple threat, Thanos would lose much of the unsettling quality the film wants. Instead, his face is allowed to remain readable. That matters because his most disturbing characteristic is not rage, it is certainty. The effects preserve enough human performance for the audience to see thought behind the scale. Sound reinforces this distinction. Many of the heroes produce busy sonic environments. Tony's armor transforms and responds. Strange's magic carries its own texture. Large battles layer impacts, movement, machines, energy, and crowds. Thanos often feels comparatively controlled. His presence does not require constant sonic chaos to communicate danger. The movie frequently lets his voice and physical movement carry authority without forcing every appearance into maximum noise. That restraint makes him feel more secure. He rarely sounds like someone attempting to prove that he is powerful. The filmmaking behaves as though his power is already understood. Alan Silvestri's score has a related job. A crossover this large could easily become trapped in musical nostalgia, constantly reminding us which character or franchise has entered the frame. Instead, the score has to create enough unity for the movie to feel like one event rather than several films being edited together. The familiar Avengers musical language is therefore most powerful when it represents collective heroic possibility. The effect depends on timing. If a recognizable musical idea appears constantly, it becomes wallpaper. When it arrives after separation or uncertainty, it can communicate the emotional idea of convergence before the characters themselves have completely achieved it. Music becomes a promise of unity. Infinity War then makes that promise difficult to fulfill. Production design performs similar connective work. Titan is perhaps the clearest example. The environment does not simply provide an exotic location for combat. Its ruined scale gives Thanos' worldview a physical backdrop. The place appears shaped by a history of collapse, which allows him to point toward destruction as if destruction itself proves his argument. That does not make his conclusion correct. It makes the setting psychologically useful to him. Wakanda operates differently. Its design communicates organization, technological capability, and collective identity. When the battle reaches it, the contrast between the structured environment and the invading force gives the conflict another layer. Wakanda represents an attempt to protect. The approaching army represents pressure that does not care what has been built there. The location is therefore emotionally different from Titan, even though both eventually contain major action. One is ruin already experienced, the other is a functioning place threatened with ruin. Costume and silhouette also become practical storytelling tools. With so many characters sharing frames, instant recognition matters. The audience should not have to stop and identify who is acting. Distinct silhouettes, movement styles, weapons, and power effects allow the film to preserve clarity even when the screen becomes crowded. That kind of clarity sounds technical, but it has emotional consequences. If the audience cannot quickly understand who is where, danger becomes generic. If we can identify the character, the danger remains personal. The film's craft is therefore strongest when scale does not erase specificity. That is the central achievement of its convergence. Direction organizes incompatible personalities. Editing turns geographical fragmentation into momentum. Visual effects preserve individual powers while allowing them to interact. Sound creates differences between chaos and control. The score occasionally reminds us of the unity these characters are struggling to recover. Production design gives each battlefield thematic character rather than treating every location as an interchangeable arena. None of these systems is flawless. There are moments where the sheer quantity of digital activity reduces physical texture. There are tonal transitions that move faster than the emotion underneath them. Some character beats inevitably feel abbreviated because the edit must return to another group. But when Infinity War is functioning at its best, the craft is not merely making a giant movie look expensive. It is expressing the argument. The heroes possess different skills, different histories, different visual languages, and different emotional priorities. The movie's filmmaking keeps trying to make those differences cooperate without pretending they disappear. That mirrors the story itself. Unity here does not mean sameness. It means incompatible pieces finding enough shared purpose to act together before time runs out. And that raises the harder question the film now has to survive. If the craft is this effective at generating urgency, scale, and emotional momentum, does the screenplay always support that pressure with equally convincing character logic? Because the more confidently a movie pushes us forward, the more important it becomes to examine the places where the machinery starts to resist. Infinity War's most consequential weakness comes from the same structure that gives it so much momentum. Almost every character is moving so quickly toward the next crisis that some decisions have to carry more dramatic weight than the film has time to fully prepare. The clearest example is the dependence on emotional impulsiveness at crucial turning points. Throughout the movie, the heroes are defined by attachment. That is part of the film's central argument, and much of the time it works beautifully. Love, loyalty, grief, and responsibility prevent these characters from becoming cold, strategic machines. The difficulty appears when the screenplay needs emotion not only to reveal character, but to change the direction of the plot at exactly the required moment. There is a difference between a character making a painful mistake and the audience feeling the machinery behind that mistake. Infinity War sometimes gets dangerously close to that line. The Titan sequence is the strongest case. The heroes' temporary coordination is one of the film's most satisfying demonstrations of teamwork because their very different abilities finally form a coherent plan. The scene creates the feeling that victory may be possible not through greater individual strength, but through combination. Then emotional pressure enters. Without exposing the full consequence before the spoiler section, the important point is that the plan becomes vulnerable when grief overwhelms strategy. The behavior is understandable at a character level. This is someone reacting to devastating personal information, not a machine making the optimal decision. The problem is timing. Because the sequence has worked so hard to make cooperation feel precise, the emotional interruption can feel like the screenplay placing its hand on the scale. The strongest defense is that this is exactly the film's theme. Infinity War has repeatedly argued that these characters cannot separate strategic responsibility from personal attachment. It would almost betray that argument if every hero suddenly behaved with perfect emotional discipline at the moment when discipline mattered most. That defense is persuasive, but thematic consistency does not automatically remove dramatic frustration. A choice can make psychological sense and still feel mechanically convenient. The scene therefore becomes one of the movie's most revealing imperfections. The flaw is not that a character feels too much. The flaw is that the screenplay needs one emotional reaction to arrive with such exact destructive timing that the audience can briefly see the structure underneath the feeling. A smaller limitation comes from the distribution of character attention. Infinity War has an enormous cast, and the screenplay is surprisingly efficient in moving between groups. Yet efficiency creates hierarchy. Some characters receive pressure, contradiction, and emotional movement. Others mostly contribute function. This becomes especially noticeable with heroes whose inner conflicts are less directly connected to the stones or to Thanos. They may appear, fight, make a useful decision, or support someone else's arc without receiving much psychological development of their own. That does not make them irrelevant, it makes them supporting architecture. For a crossover of this size, that may be unavoidable. Giving every established hero a complete emotional journey would either produce a much longer film or destroy the momentum that currently holds the narrative together. The reasonable defense, then, is structural necessity. Infinity War is not trying to give equal narrative ownership to everyone. It concentrates attention where the central moral pressure is strongest. Tony, Thor, Gamora, Wanda, Vision, Strange, Quill, and Thanos carry more of the film's emotional argument because their choices directly intersect with sacrifice, control, grief, or responsibility. Characters positioned further from that argument inevitably receive less depth. The trade-off works more often than it fails, but the result is still uneven. Another point of friction is tonal timing. The film uses humor as relief, characterization, and a way to preserve the identities of different franchises. Some of the funniest material works precisely because serious characters are forced into contact with personalities who process danger differently. The problem arrives when comedy appears too soon after emotional weight. A joke does not automatically weaken a dark scene. In fact, characters often use humor when frightened, uncomfortable, or grieving. That can make them feel more human. But when the edit seems eager to reassure the audience that the movie is still entertaining, the emotional aftershock of a scene can be shortened. Infinity War occasionally moves away from discomfort before the discomfort has fully settled. This is not destructive. It is more like a recurring pressure release valve that sometimes opens a few seconds early. The defense is again connected to the film's scale. Without tonal variation, 2.5 hours of escalating cosmic catastrophe could become emotionally flat. Constant seriousness would not necessarily create more weight, it might simply reduce contrast, so the issue is not whether humor belongs. It is whether every individual transition earns it. There is also a larger structural challenge in the way Thanos dominates the movie. Giving the antagonist such strong forward momentum is one of Infinity War's best decisions. It creates urgency and gives the film a center despite the scattered heroes. Yet this emphasis can make the protagonists feel reactive for long stretches. They protect, they pursue, they improvise, they try to slow his progress. Thanos is the character whose objective most clearly organizes the beginning, middle, and destination of the plot. That asymmetry is deliberate, but it slightly complicates the heroic side of the film. Many Avengers are participating in the story. Fewer are truly shaping its direction. Again, the strongest counterargument is that this is precisely why the movie feels different. The heroes are supposed to be behind. Their fragmented state is supposed to matter. The film would lose much of its pressure if they quickly formed a single initiative and made Thanos react to them. So this limitation is inseparable from one of the film's greatest strengths. That pattern defines Infinity War's friction more generally. Its weaknesses are rarely random failures, they are often the cost of its ambitions. A huge ensemble creates uneven character depth. Relentless momentum compresses emotional processing. A theme built around attachment makes certain impulsive decisions both meaningful and frustrating. Tonal variety keeps the film accessible while occasionally reducing dramatic residue. An antagonist-driven structure produces extraordinary urgency while making some heroes feel like passengers inside his campaign. None of these problems destroys the movie, but they prevent the scale from becoming effortless. Infinity War works because it is constantly balancing too many things at once, and occasionally we can feel the strain. That strain is useful to acknowledge because the film's achievement becomes clearer when we stop pretending its size automatically equals control. The impressive part is not that every piece fits perfectly. It is that so many incompatible pieces create a coherent emotional direction despite the visible seams, and once those seams are recognized, the next question becomes larger than the film itself. Infinity War did not appear in isolation. Its structure, its antagonist, its willingness to leave heroes vulnerable, and even its dependence on audience familiarity all belong to a specific moment in superhero cinema. To understand why those choices landed with such force, we need to widen the frame. Infinity War arrived at a point when the Marvel Cinematic Universe had already trained its audience to expect convergence. For years, separate heroes had occupied different corners of the same continuity. Their individual movies could have distinct tones and concerns, but the larger promise remained visible in the background. Eventually, characters, consequences, and objects introduced across different stories would matter together. That makes Infinity War unusual even before considering its plot. The film is not merely adapting the structure of a superhero team-up, it is trying to convert long-term franchise accumulation into dramatic pressure. Normally, continuity is treated as a reward. A returning character produces recognition. A familiar object creates connection. A reference tells longtime viewers that their attention mattered. Infinity War makes continuity less comfortable. Past choices return as vulnerabilities. Broken relationships reduce coordination. Previous losses shape current behavior. Objects that once belonged to separate adventures become parts of the same threat. The film therefore turns the franchise itself into narrative material. That distinction matters because by 2018, superhero cinema had already made large-scale crossover spectacle familiar. Simply increasing the number of recognizable characters could no longer guarantee dramatic significance. The challenge was not getting the heroes into the same movie. The challenge was making their shared presence mean something. Infinity War's answer is fragmentation. Instead of gathering everyone into one triumphant superteam early and allowing the crossover to become a celebration, the movie separates its characters into temporary combinations. That decision places it closer to a disaster narrative than a conventional team origin story. The danger is already spreading, communication is incomplete, different groups experience different parts of the crisis. No single hero understands everything soon enough. That structure gives the film a sense of emergency that distinguishes it from earlier Avengers stories. The first Avengers film gains pleasure from watching incompatible personalities gradually become a functioning team. Age of Ultron tests what happens when that team's own decisions create instability. Infinity War begins after unity has already been damaged. The heroes are powerful, experienced, and famous within their world, yet structurally they are less prepared to behave as one body. This makes the film's place in the franchise important to its meaning. Years of expansion created more heroes. Years of conflict also created more distance between them. Growth did not automatically produce cohesion. That idea separates Infinity War from the fantasy that a larger alliance must always be a stronger one. The movie also belongs to a broader tradition of blockbuster villains who are given enough ideological structure to challenge the heroes beyond physical combat. Thanos is not interesting simply because he is stronger. He believes he has solved a problem. His worldview is monstrous because it transforms living beings into units inside a calculation. But the film gives him enough internal consistency that defeating his body would not automatically answer his argument. That choice reflects a shift in what large franchise villains increasingly needed to provide. A giant threat could no longer be only destructive. the antagonist had to create interpretation. Thanos gives Infinity War a proposition that the heroes must reject not merely through violence, but through the way they value individual lives. This is also where the movie interacts with a recurring superhero tension between individual morality and enormous scale. Superhero narratives regularly ask characters to protect cities, planets, or universes. The larger the stakes become, the easier those lives can become abstract. Infinity War repeatedly resists that abstraction by making its biggest decisions personal. The universe may be at risk, but the emotional question is often whether one character can surrender another. That tension allows the movie to operate simultaneously as franchise spectacle and intimate moral drama. Its scale tells us the stakes are enormous. Its relationships tell us why enormous stakes matter. There is another important context here. Infinity War refuses to behave like a self-contained endpoint. It is part of a larger serialized architecture, and the film openly uses that condition. That gives it freedoms a standalone blockbuster would not necessarily possess. Character arcs can remain unresolved. Relationships can stop at points of extreme pressure. The ending can function as a rupture rather than a conventional restoration of order, but serialization also creates a risk. If audiences assume another installment will eventually continue the story, then apparent finality can lose some power. Franchise awareness sits outside the film, reminding us that this universe is designed to keep moving. Infinity War has to generate emotional consequence despite that knowledge. Its solution is not to pretend continuation does not exist. Instead, it concentrates on immediate experience. What matters while watching is that the heroes do not possess the guarantee they usually seem to carry. The narrative behaves as though accumulated franchise history is no protection against failure. This is why the film's darker turns are more effective than simple shock tactics. They attack an expectation built by the genre itself. Superheroes generally transform impossible situations into survivable ones. Infinity War keeps narrowing the possibility of escape. The movie asks whether optimism remains meaningful when the structure that normally rewards optimism stops cooperating, and yet it does not become cynical. Steve's refusal to abandon Vision is still treated with seriousness. Peter's impulse to help is still recognizable as heroic. Wanda's attachment is not mocked as irrational. Thor's determination is not reduced to empty aggression. The film allows heroism to retain moral value even when heroism does not guarantee control. That may be Infinity War's most important position within superhero cinema. It separates righteousness from outcome. The heroes do not automatically become wrong because events turn against them. Thanos does not become right because his plan advances. Success and moral legitimacy are not the same thing. For a genre built so often around victorious heroes, that distinction gives the movie unusual tension. Infinity War uses the enormous machinery of a franchise to arrive at a surprisingly old dramatic question. What does conviction mean when doing what you believe is right does not ensure that you will win? The wider context therefore brings us back to this specific film rather than away from it. Its crossover scale, serialized history, fractured heroes, antagonist-driven structure, and willingness to deny easy reassurance all reinforce the same central pressure. And the production itself had to solve an equally difficult problem. How do you actually build a movie containing this many characters, locations, effects, and interconnected histories without letting the logistics overwhelm the drama? That is where the documented choices behind Infinity War become especially revealing. Infinity War's production history reinforces something the film itself keeps suggesting. The challenge was not simply making everything bigger. It was finding a principle strong enough to organize the size. Anthony and Joe Russo described the divided Avengers after Civil War as a deliberate starting condition, asking what happens when the greatest threat these characters have faced arrives while the team remains fractured. They also worked for months with writers Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely, and consulted filmmakers responsible for other Marvel corners, including Ryan Coogler, Taika Waititi, James Gunn, Peyton Reed, and Scott Derrickson, partly to keep characters recognizable while combining their different tones. That collaboration helps explain why Infinity War generally avoids making every character sound as though they suddenly belong to the same franchise. The Guardians retain their disruptive comic rhythm. Strange retains his controlled authority. Wakanda does not become visually interchangeable with an Avengers facility. Thor carries developments from his recent story rather than reverting to an older version of himself. The continuity was not merely protected, it became part of the dramatic design. A second revealing production choice concerns Thanos. Anthony Russo later described the film through the model of an epic heist, with Thanos functioning as the central character pursuing the stones. The filmmakers built his introduction early and used that concept as an organizing principle for the larger movie. That production decision clarifies why the narrative has felt antagonist-driven throughout this analysis. The locations may change. The heroic groups may divide and reconnect. But Thanos supplies the straightest line through the film. Treating his campaign almost like a heist gives each stone a destination and each encounter a function. Instead of asking how dozens of heroes can each receive their own independent plot, the movie allows them to collide with different stages of one advancing objective. The third fact concerns how Thanos himself was constructed. Visual effects supervisor Dan DeLeo explained that the production performed early motion capture tests with Josh Brolin, specifically to determine whether his performance could survive inside the digital character. Brolin's captured work was transferred into the Thanos animation process so that the filmmakers could evaluate how effectively his emotional performance translated. That matters more than the technical achievement by itself. Infinity War depends on Thanos being readable at close range. His threat cannot exist only through size and physical strength, because some of his most important scenes depend on stillness, certainty, hesitation, and controlled emotional reaction. Preserving Brolin's performance allows the visual effect to function as acting rather than as a barrier placed over acting. Finally, production designer Charles Wood described a workflow in which practical scenery often provided the physical foundation for larger digital environments. Portions of otherworldly landscapes were physically constructed for actors to interact with and then extended virtually. Wakanda likewise combined constructed elements with broader digital world building, including new areas designed specifically around Infinity War's battle requirements. That hybrid approach helps explain why the movie's strongest digital spaces still possess some physical weight. The environments are not convincing merely because they are detailed. They give performers something spatial to respond to, while the visual effects work expands those spaces beyond practical limitations. Taken together, these production decisions reveal a consistent priority: preserve character identity, give the massive plot one organizing force, keep human performance visible inside digital spectacle, build enough physical reality beneath virtual scale that characters still appear to occupy environments rather than illustrations. Those choices do not automatically solve every problem created by Infinity War's ambition, but they show that much of what appears effortless on screen was actually a problem of coordination. And coordination is precisely what the story itself is about. The filmmakers had to unite different cinematic worlds without erasing their differences, just as the heroes must combine radically different personalities without becoming identical. The production solved that challenge well enough to make convergence feel natural. But there is another way to read the film's central argument, and it challenges one of the assumptions we have been building from the beginning. The strongest challenge to our reading of Infinity War is that the film may not actually be defending attachment as strongly as it first appears. Perhaps it is exposing attachment as the weakness that repeatedly prevents its heroes from making the decision the situation requires. That interpretation begins with a simple observation. Again and again, the characters most committed to protecting individuals hesitate when the larger crisis demands a colder choice. Steve refuses to treat Vision as expendable. Wanda resists the possibility of losing him. Quill's feelings for Gamora affect his judgment. Tony continues trying to protect Peter even while allowing him deeper into the conflict. Thor converts grief into a personal mission to confront Thanos on his own terms. Seen from this angle, Infinity War becomes less a defense of emotional connection and more a warning about what happens when heroes cannot separate love from strategy. The evidence is uncomfortable because the film repeatedly allows Thanos to advance through openings created by emotion. The heroes are often intelligent enough to understand the stakes. Their problem is accepting them. Vision, notably, is more willing than several people around him to consider the possibility that his own survival cannot be the highest priority. If we take that seriously, Steve's refusal to abandon him may begin to look less like moral courage and more like a principle maintained beyond the point where circumstances can afford it. That does not make Steve selfish. It makes his morality rigid. The distinction matters. Steve's ethical identity has been built around resisting systems that reduce individuals to expendable pieces. His instinct is therefore consistent, yet consistency is not automatically wisdom. A principle designed to protect human dignity in ordinary conflict may become dangerously difficult when the scale changes from one life to unimaginably many. Infinity War can therefore be read as testing whether heroic morality itself has limits. Perhaps the heroes fail not because they care too little, but because they cannot accept that responsibility sometimes requires an action that feels morally unbearable. That reading makes Thanos more complicated without making him correct. His worldview remains built on coercion. His authority is self-appointed. His calculation reduces people to numbers. Nothing about the hero's mistakes validates his ideology, but the film may still be granting him one strategic advantage that is genuinely real. He can act. The heroes keep searching for a solution that preserves every value at once. Thanos accepts irreversible consequences immediately. That difference creates speed. And in a story where time is constantly disappearing, speed becomes power. The counterreading therefore argues that the central tragedy is not simply that Thanos imposes sacrifice while the heroes understand its true meaning. The tragedy may be that the heroes have become dependent on the belief that sacrifice can always be avoided. Their history has taught them to expect another option. Technology might provide it, magic might reveal it, a new ally might arrive, a final plan might work. The structure of superhero storytelling has repeatedly rewarded this refusal to accept impossible choices. Infinity War asks what happens when the universe stops providing exits. Under that interpretation, the attempt to save Vision becomes particularly revealing. The heroes are not wrong to seek another solution. The moral instinct is admirable. But the entire strategy depends on having enough time to achieve both goals. Protect Vision, protect the stone, protect everyone else. The ambition is heroic precisely because it rejects the cruelty of choosing. The danger is that refusing to choose does not stop the clock. This alternative reading also changes how we understand Thanos' certainty. Earlier, we treated his lack of hesitation as evidence of moral corruption. That remains true, but certainty itself is not the problem. The problem is what certainty is attached to. A hero might need decisive conviction too. Infinity War may therefore be criticizing two extremes at once. Thanos acts without sufficient moral doubt. The heroes sometimes doubt without sufficient willingness to act. Between those positions lies the harder form of responsibility the movie never allows anyone to fully master. Making a painful decision without becoming indifferent to the person who suffers from it. That is a much less comfortable interpretation than simply saying the heroes represent compassion and Thanos represents abstraction. It also explains some of the movie's most frustrating choices. Characters do not fail despite their emotions. They may fail through them. Love can narrow perception. Grief can become impulsiveness. Loyalty can delay action. Hope can become denial. The qualities that make the heroes worth caring about can also prevent them from behaving with perfect strategic efficiency. So which reading explains Infinity War better? The first reading recognizes something essential. The movie repeatedly shows that Thanos' supposed sacrifices are morally distorted because he claims authority over other lives. The hero's attachment to individuals preserves the human value his philosophy erases. The counterreading identifies something equally important. Preserving that value does not guarantee good outcomes. Compassion without timing, discipline, or acceptance of consequence can become tragically ineffective. The film becomes richer when both ideas remain present. I would not read Infinity War as an argument that the heroes should simply become more like Thanos. That would misunderstand the moral distinction the story carefully maintains. but I do think the movie is harsher toward heroic idealism than it first appears. It suggests that refusing cruelty is necessary, but refusing every painful choice may not be possible. That uncertainty is what keeps the film from collapsing into a simple moral equation. The heroes are not wrong because they care. Thanos is not right because he acts decisively. The tragedy exists in the space between those truths, and once that possibility is visible, several apparently ordinary details from earlier in the film begin to look different. On a second viewing, Infinity War quietly signals how often its characters are being prepared for choices they do not yet realize they will have to make. Infinity War becomes more revealing on a second viewing because several details that initially feel like ordinary characterization are quietly preparing us for later. Choices. The first signal is the repeated contrast between certainty and hesitation. Thanos moves through the film with a frightening absence of visible doubt. Even before the full consequences of his campaign are understood, his behavior suggests that the decision has already been made inside him. He rarely appears to be discovering what he believes. He is executing something he settled long ago. The heroes behave differently. They pause, they argue, they search for alternatives, they try to preserve options. On a first viewing, those moments mainly create suspense. On a rewatch, they begin to form a pattern. Infinity War is repeatedly showing us that the hero's greatest obstacle may not be a lack of power, but an inability to reach the kind of irreversible certainty that Thanos has already embraced. Doctor Strange becomes especially interesting under that lens. His performance is built around observation. He often appears to be processing more than he says, and the film repeatedly associates him with knowledge other characters do not possess. Initially, that simply fits his role as the guardian of the Time Stone. On a second viewing, his stillness becomes more suspicious. Strange is not always reacting with the same urgency as Tony because his relationship with possibility is different. Tony wants to create the winning plan through intelligence and improvisation. Strange increasingly behaves like someone trying to understand which possibilities exist at all. That difference appears small before later context gives it weight. Tony's behavior contains another recurring signal. He keeps trying to control distance. He wants Peter away from dangers that exceed Peter's experience. He clashes with Strange over decision-making. He moves toward Thanos partly because waiting for the threat to arrive has become psychologically intolerable. Tony's instinct is to reduce uncertainty by getting closer to the problem. That pattern matters because Infinity War repeatedly places him in situations where proximity does not equal control. The closer he gets to the threat, the less dependable his usual advantages become. Peter Parker also carries a subtle visual and behavioral pattern. He is constantly entering spaces that are larger than the role Tony imagined for him. The progression is almost geographical. Peter begins connected to an ordinary human environment. He follows the danger farther than Tony wants. The physical distance from home increases alongside the emotional seriousness of his situation. On a first viewing, that movement feels like escalation. On a second, it feels like preparation. Infinity War is gradually removing Peter from every layer of safety associated with his earlier identity. Thor's behavior is similarly transformed by hindsight. His confidence can initially look like recovery. He suffers devastating loss, finds a new objective, and begins moving toward greater power. The structure resembles a familiar heroic rebound. Defeat creates determination, determination creates preparation, and preparation appears to promise a stronger return. But repeated viewing changes the emotional texture. Thor's certainty is not the same as emotional healing. He speaks about loss with an almost unsettling composure, then immediately converts grief into purpose. The film quietly signals that vengeance and responsibility are becoming difficult for him to separate. The mission gives him direction. That does not necessarily mean it gives him clarity. Vision and Wanda carry perhaps the most obvious rewatch pattern, but it is effective because the film does not treat it as a hidden clue. Their scenes repeatedly associate intimacy with limited time. They want private space. The larger conflict keeps invading it. They want the possibility of choosing their own future. The stone makes Vision part of someone else's plan. This tension is visible from the beginning of their material. On a first viewing, it gives their relationship urgency. On a rewatch, every attempt at ordinary closeness becomes haunted by the knowledge that the story is steadily turning their love into a moral test. The Mind Stone itself changes meaning through repetition. At first, it is primarily one part of the larger Infinity Stone mythology. As the film continues, it becomes less an object and more a deadline. Every conversation around it narrows the available choices. Protect it, remove it, destroy it, protect Vision, protect everyone else. The object remains visually consistent while its emotional meaning becomes heavier. That is exactly the kind of rewatch signal Infinity War handles well. The film does not need to hide an elaborate secret inside every frame. It allows familiar objects and gestures to accumulate new significance because later events change how we interpret what came before. Even the heroes' separation begins to look different. On first viewing, the divided groups help manage a huge ensemble. On rewatch, the fragmentation becomes thematic. Characters who desperately need collective strength keep confronting the crisis in incomplete combinations. Tony is separated from Steve. Thor follows another route. Wanda and Vision attempt to escape larger obligations. The Guardians enter the conflict through their own personal connection. The movie's geography repeatedly reflects its emotional problem. Everybody is trying to save the universe. Very few of them are standing together while doing it. Infinity War therefore rewards a second viewing less through traditional surprise than through altered emphasis. A pause becomes more important. A refusal sounds different. An expression of confidence acquires doubt underneath it. A private relationship starts to resemble a future decision. A plan that once looked heroic begins to reveal the risk hidden inside its optimism. The film has been placing these signals in plain sight because its deepest design does not depend on concealing information. It depends on changing what the information means. And once the final pieces are revealed, the pattern of sacrifice, hesitation, control, grief, and fractured cooperation becomes impossible to read in quite the same way again. From this point on, the ending, the reveals, and their meaning are all on the table. If you want the film unspoiled, pause here and come back after you've seen it. Infinity War finally exposes the full shape of its argument when the heroes begin reaching the moments they have spent the entire film trying to postpone. Until now, almost every group has been searching for another option. Gamora wants Thanos stopped without allowing what she knows to become useful to him. Quill wants to protect Gamora without accepting what protecting the universe might eventually demand. Steve wants Vision saved without surrendering the Mind Stone. Wanda wants the same impossible combination. Tony and Strange want Thanos defeated without allowing his campaign to reach Earth. Thor wants enough power to turn catastrophic loss into a second chance. Each plan contains hope that the terrible choice can somehow be avoided. The ending is what happens when the film starts removing those alternatives one by one. Gamora's confrontation with Thanos gives us the most disturbing version of sacrifice because it reveals exactly how he misunderstands the concept. To obtain the Soul Stone, Thanos is required to lose someone he loves. The film wants this moment to complicate him. His grief is presented as real. He does not behave as though Gamora means nothing to him. That emotional reality is important. It is also where the moral distinction we have been tracing becomes clearest. Thanos experiences pain. Gamora experiences the consequence. He calls his suffering proof of sacrifice, but he is still the person exercising power over someone else's life. The cost hurts him, yet she pays it. That distinction destroys the moral equivalence he wants to create between himself and the heroes. Vision is willing to risk his own existence. Gamora is not voluntarily offering herself to validate Thanos' mission. Thanos therefore reveals the deepest corruption inside his philosophy. He believes feeling pain while committing an atrocity transforms the atrocity into responsibility. It does not. His grief may make him more psychologically complex, but complexity is not absolution. In fact, the scene makes him more frightening because it demonstrates that affection itself cannot interrupt his ideology. Love becomes something he is willing to destroy in order to prove how committed he is to a belief. That is domination at its most intimate. The Titan confrontation then brings the heroic side of the argument to its breaking point. Doctor Strange has examined an enormous range of possible futures and discovers that victory exists only within an extraordinarily narrow path. That changes his behavior retroactively. His calmness, observation, and willingness to make decisions other characters do not understand now carry additional meaning. He is no longer simply improvising against Thanos. He has seen that almost every available route ends in failure. This is one of Infinity War's most important reveals because it transforms the idea of control. Tony has spent much of the film trying to create the solution. Strange reaches a point where creation becomes recognition. He cannot manufacture endless winning possibilities. He can only identify the path that exists and decide whether he is willing to enter it. The battle itself briefly suggests the heroes may succeed through exactly the quality Thanos lacks: cooperation. Their powers become complementary. They restrain him. They disrupt his control. Mantis reaches his mind. For a moment, the Infinity Gauntlet can potentially be separated from him. This is the closest the film comes to providing the traditional answer. Different heroes unite. Their abilities combine. The seemingly unstoppable villain becomes vulnerable. Then Quill learns what happened to Gamora. His reaction destroys the fragile discipline of the plan. It is easy to criticize him here, and strategically the criticism is unavoidable. His grief has consequences far beyond himself, but Infinity War has been preparing this exact contradiction. Quill's emotional attachment is part of why he is capable of loving Gamora, protecting her, and responding to her as a person rather than an asset. That same attachment becomes catastrophic when grief removes his ability to preserve the group's strategy. The movie does not allow us the comfort of separating admirable feeling from destructive behavior. Both emerge from the same person. This is why the moment remains more interesting than a simple plot mistake. It is frustrating because the heroes were close. It is thematically coherent because Infinity War has repeatedly asked whether intense attachment can survive strategic pressure without turning into blindness. Here, the answer is no. Thanos escapes. The cost of Quill's reaction spreads beyond the person whose loss caused it. That is one of the film's harshest ideas. Emotion can be completely understandable and still produce consequences that understanding does not erase. Tony's confrontation with Thanos then becomes personal in another way. For years, Tony has feared a threat larger than what Earth is prepared to face. Thanos is the physical arrival of that fear. Tony finally stands directly in front of the thing his anxiety has been anticipating, yet proximity gives him no mastery. His technology adapts, his intelligence finds openings, his refusal to stop fighting remains unmistakable. Still, the encounter steadily reduces him from strategist to survivor. That reduction matters because Tony's identity has long been built around solving the unsolvable through invention. Thanos becomes the problem that invention alone cannot resolve. When Strange eventually gives up the Time Stone to preserve Tony's life, the decision initially appears to contradict his earlier priorities. He had treated the stone as more important than individual survival. Now he surrenders it, but the future he has seen changes the meaning of that choice. Strange is no longer simply saving Tony. He is accepting a sequence whose purpose Tony cannot yet understand. That makes Strange's decision perhaps the film's purest example of sacrifice understood correctly. He relinquishes immediate control. He accepts being misunderstood. He allows a terrible outcome to continue because his knowledge tells him that preventing the immediate loss would eliminate the distant possibility of victory. The difference from Thanos is crucial. Strange is not declaring that suffering becomes morally acceptable because he personally believes in a grand theory. He is acting within a specific crisis after confronting the available outcomes. Even then, the film does not make the choice emotionally comfortable. Knowledge does not remove cost. It only changes what responsibility might require. Meanwhile, Wakanda turns the entire moral argument into a race against time. The heroes have chosen the compassionate option. They will try to separate Vision from the Mind Stone without killing him. The battle outside exists largely to protect the time needed for that choice. This makes the Wakandan defense more than spectacle. Every minute of resistance represents the hero's refusal to accept Thanos' premise that one life must simply be discarded. Then the alternative fails. Thanos approaches. The time required for the humane solution disappears. Wanda is finally forced into the decision she has resisted throughout the film. Vision asks her to destroy the stone even though doing so will kill him. Now the structure of sacrifice changes. Vision accepts the cost himself. Wanda is the person forced to carry it out. Steve and the others cannot create another path. The scene works because the film slows the moral problem down even while the external danger is accelerating. Wanda possesses enough power to make the necessary action possible, yet that power gives her no emotional protection from what the action means. Her strength becomes the mechanism of her grief. When she finally destroys the stone and Vision dies, the heroes have seemingly reached the painful form of responsibility that the counter-reading suggested they might need. They have stopped searching for another option. They accept the unbearable cost. And for one brief moment, it appears that this sacrifice may have mattered. Then Thanos uses the Time Stone. This is the point where Infinity War becomes especially cruel. Wanda's decision is not merely defeated, it is reversed. She is forced to experience the loss without receiving the strategic outcome that made the loss necessary. Thanos restores Vision only long enough to take the Mind Stone himself. The film therefore separates sacrifice from reward. Doing the difficult thing does not guarantee that the universe will honor the difficulty. That is almost the opposite of the normal emotional contract of superhero storytelling. Sacrifice usually purchases something: time, victory, redemption, survival for someone else. Here, Wanda makes the required choice and Thanos possesses enough power to invalidate its practical effect. Her morality remains meaningful. Her action fails. Infinity War again insists that moral legitimacy and successful outcome are different categories. Then Thor arrives. His entrance initially looks like the heroic correction the film has been withholding. He has survived. He has obtained the weapon he sought. His grief has been transformed into enough strength to challenge Thanos directly. When he finally strikes, the film gives the moment enormous release. Thor has reached the enemy who has shaped his entire trajectory. This should be the answer to his journey, but the choice he makes reveals the unresolved flaw inside that journey. Thor wants Thanos to know who defeated him. He does not simply want the threat ended, he wants recognition. His grief has remained personal. That desire creates the opening Thanos needs. The crucial mistake is not that Thor lacks power, it is that power is still serving vengeance. This resolves one of the film's strongest rewatch signals. Thor's journey looked like recovery because he converted grief into action. The ending reveals that he never fully converted revenge into responsibility. He became strong enough. He did not become detached enough from the emotional satisfaction he wanted. And then Thanos completes his objective. The snap is almost frighteningly small compared with the battles that precede it. That formal choice matters. A movie built around giant armies, cosmic weapons, collapsing environments, and extraordinary powers reduces its decisive action to a gesture. The universe does not end with an enormous explosion. It changes with terrifying simplicity. That simplicity expresses Thanos' worldview. For him, unimaginable loss has been reduced to execution of a plan. Then Infinity War does something even more effective. It stops making the consequence abstract. Characters begin disappearing, not armies in distant galaxies, people we know. The film returns from cosmic scale to individual faces. Bucky disappears in front of Steve. Wakandan fighters vanish. Members of the Guardians are lost. Doctor Strange disappears after indicating that what has happened belongs to the narrow path he foresaw. Then Peter Parker turns toward Tony. This is the emotional culmination of Tony's entire pressure map. Tony has spent the film trying to manage Peter's distance from danger. He could not keep him away. He could not control the situation. He cannot solve what is happening now. Peter's fear strips the event of any remaining abstraction. He does not disappear as a superhero completing a glorious sacrifice. For a few painful moments, he is simply young and frightened. Tony can do nothing except remain there. The man whose response to fear is to build, plan, calculate, and intervene has reached a situation where none of those instincts can alter what is happening directly in front of him. That is why Peter's disappearance matters beyond shock. It completes Tony's confrontation with helplessness. The film then refuses to provide immediate correction. There is no last-second reversal, no hidden victory suddenly revealed, no heroic rally that repairs the emotional damage before the credits. Thanos retreats and experiences the peace he believed his mission would create. The heroes remain inside the consequence. This final contrast answers our deep-view question. Why does Infinity War feel less like a victory lap and more like a collision between definitions of sacrifice? because the film systematically denies the idea that sacrifice is valuable simply because someone suffers. Thanos suffers and remains morally monstrous because he turns other lives into material for his objective. Vision's willingness to lose his life matters because the decision concerns his own existence. Wanda's willingness to act matters because love does not erase her recognition of the larger stakes. Strange gives up immediate control because he understands a possibility no one else can yet see. Thor's failure shows that pain can produce strength without producing wisdom. Quill shows that genuine love can become destructive when grief overwhelms responsibility, and Tony discovers that responsibility does not guarantee the power to protect everyone placed within it. The movie's final answer is therefore uncomfortable. Sacrifice is not defined by pain. It is defined by responsibility, consent, purpose, and who has the authority to choose the cost. That is exactly where Thanos fails his own moral argument. He believes willingness to endure personal anguish grants him permission to impose unimaginable anguish on everyone else. The movie gives him victory without granting him moral correctness, and the post-credits scene extends the consequence without undoing it. Nick Fury and Maria Hill witness the same disappearance spreading into ordinary life. Fury manages to send a signal before he vanishes, introducing one final possibility of response. The moment matters because it widens the catastrophe again. What happened in Wakanda and on Titan is not confined to superheroes. Systems break, people disappear, the effects ripple through ordinary space, yet that final signal also preserves one thread of resistance. The heroes have lost control of the present, the future has not been completely closed. That distinction prevents Infinity War from becoming nihilistic. The film ends in defeat, but not in the claim that meaning is impossible. The characters' choices still matter even when those choices fail. Their compassion still matters even when compassion becomes costly. Their mistakes still matter because emotion does not excuse consequence. And Thanos' success does not validate the philosophy that produced it. If anything, the ending clarifies the danger of allowing certainty to become absolute. Infinity War earns its final rupture because it has spent the entire movie removing escape routes from characters who are accustomed to creating them. The real defeat is not simply that Thanos becomes more powerful. It is that the heroes eventually reach the correct battlefield with too many unresolved fractures, too many competing priorities, too many emotional wounds, and too little time. Their individual virtues never fully become collective discipline. That is the hidden pattern the rewatch exposes. Tony keeps seeking control, Thor keeps converting grief into action, Steve keeps refusing to surrender individuals, Wanda keeps trying to protect love from becoming calculation, Quill keeps treating attachment as something worth acting upon, Strange keeps watching possibilities. Each instinct makes sense in isolation. Thanos wins inside the gaps between them, so the ending does not prove that compassion is weakness. It proves that compassion without coordination can be defeated. It does not prove that sacrifice is meaningless. It proves that sacrifice does not automatically purchase victory, and it does not prove that the strongest person deserves to decide the future. It shows how terrifying the universe becomes when someone powerful enough begins believing that strength itself gives him that right. Infinity War's achievement is that it lets its villain complete the plot without allowing him to own the meaning of the story. Thanos wins the immediate contest. The moral argument remains unresolved. And that unresolved space is exactly what the film leaves behind after the dust settles. What remains after Infinity War is not the image of its largest battle. It is the sudden quiet after characters who have spent the entire movie trying to control events discover that control has vanished. That quiet matters because the film has trained us to expect escalation. Every new stone increases the danger. Every location adds another front. Every hero brings another possible solution. The movie keeps expanding until the final consequence arrives and then the experience contracts. People look around. Somebody who was present is no longer there. A plan that seemed unfinished has become irrelevant. The emotional force comes from subtraction. That is the afterimage Infinity War leaves behind. Not simply defeat, but the realization that enormous capability did not protect these characters from irreversible uncertainty. It also changes the way Thanos' final calm can be read. He has achieved the condition he believed would justify everything that came before it. From his perspective, the absence of resistance at the end resembles peace. The film has spent more than 2 hours teaching us why that interpretation is false. Silence is not consent, stillness is not harmony. A world that has been forcibly reduced is not balanced merely because the person responsible has stopped fighting. The image, therefore, contains the central contradiction of Thanos himself. He wants to see himself as someone capable of making the decision everyone else was too weak to make. Yet his achievement depends on denying everyone else the right to participate in that decision. He reaches tranquility by removing choice. The heroes lose partly because they cannot remove choice from themselves so easily. They debate, they hesitate. They protect people whose survival complicates the larger mission. They react emotionally when loss stops being theoretical. Those qualities make them inefficient in ways Thanos is not. They are also the evidence that they still understand why individual lives matter. That is where Infinity War grows after reflection. Its ending is memorable because of the immediate shock, but shock is the least interesting part once the surprise is gone. What survives a rewatch is the structure beneath that surprise. The heroes spend the film encountering versions of the same problem without realizing how closely those choices are connected. How much are you prepared to lose? Who gets to decide? Does the scale of a goal change the morality of the method? Can refusing an intolerable choice become dangerous? Can accepting one become even more dangerous? The film does not produce one clean rule that resolves all of those questions. That restraint is valuable. Steve's position is morally persuasive even when it creates strategic risk. Vision's willingness to sacrifice himself is noble without making Wanda's resistance unreasonable. Quill's grief is understandable without making its consequences harmless. Thor's desire for justice is understandable while his desire for personal satisfaction still distorts the decisive moment. Strange's final choice appears troubling until the larger structure around his knowledge is considered. Infinity War allows these contradictions to coexist. That is why its deepest question is still alive after the plot has finished. The film does not ask whether sacrifice is good. It asks what gives sacrifice moral meaning. Pain alone cannot do it. Thanos feels pain. Conviction cannot do it. Thanos possesses overwhelming conviction. Power certainly cannot do it. His ability to force an outcome is the source of the horror. Sacrifice becomes meaningful when responsibility and agency remain connected, when a person understands the cost they are accepting, and when another person does not simply rename coercion as necessity. That distinction is what keeps Infinity War from accidentally endorsing the philosophy of the character who wins, and it is also why the movie's defeat feels more complicated than pessimism. The Avengers fail. Their values do not automatically fail with them. That separation between outcome and worth may be the idea that lingers longest. A hero is not proven right because the hero wins. A villain is not proven right because the villain succeeds. Sometimes the moral test is visible precisely when the desired outcome is denied. That brings me to the final measure. My score for Avengers, Infinity War, is 7.2 out of 10. That score reflects a film whose ambition is genuinely impressive, but whose scale also creates limitations it cannot completely hide. Its greatest achievement is structural. Infinity War takes an enormous collection of established characters, conflicting tones, separate locations, franchise histories, cosmic mythology, and large-scale action, then gives most of that material one coherent direction. Thanos provides the momentum. Sacrifice provides the thematic pressure. Fragmentation provides the dramatic problem. Because those systems reinforce one another, the film rarely feels like a collection of unrelated crossover appearances. Its strongest scenes also understand that spectacle becomes meaningful only when the audience knows what the spectacle is threatening. The Titan confrontation works because cooperation itself is at stake. Wakanda works because the battle is buying time for another moral possibility. Tony's final helplessness works because his entire character has been built around intervention. Wanda's decision works because power becomes emotionally useless at the exact moment she is forced to exercise it. Those are not simply large moments. They are large moments attached to character pressure. The limitation that holds the score down most is the compression created by the ensemble. Not every hero receives comparable depth. Some emotional transitions are shortened because another storyline needs attention. Certain crucial decisions feel thematically justified while also serving the mechanics of the plot with almost suspicious precision. The humor occasionally releases tension before the emotional weight has fully settled. And because the movie depends so heavily on previous Marvel history, some of its strongest emotional shortcuts are only as effective as the audience's existing investment. That does not make the construction unsuccessful. It makes Infinity War an unusually accomplished piece of serialized filmmaking, rather than a completely self-sufficient dramatic work. For viewers deeply invested in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, ensemble interaction, escalating pressure, and morally complicated superhero storytelling, there is a great deal here to value. The film rewards familiarity because prior relationships become part of the present stakes. For someone who prefers tightly contained character dramas, equal development across an ensemble, or stories that stand almost entirely independent of franchise history, the movie may feel crowded and relentlessly transitional. And despite the spectacle, this is not a film I value most simply because of its scale. Its rewatch value comes from seeing how early the ending's moral structure begins forming. Strange's attention changes meaning. Thor's confidence looks less secure. Vision's conversations carry greater weight. The hero's physical separation becomes more than logistical. Even Thanos' calm becomes increasingly disturbing when we recognize how completely he has eliminated moral uncertainty from his thinking. So 7.2 out of 10 feels appropriate to me. Strong in construction, unusually effective in momentum, often sharp in its character pairings, and more thematically coherent than its giant crossover premise might suggest, while still constrained by compression, tonal habits, and the demands of franchise machinery. And that leaves two questions worth carrying into the comments. When you look at the ending, do you think Infinity War is ultimately defending the hero's refusal to sacrifice individual lives, or warning that their refusal to make impossible choices comes too late? And separate from the shock of the ending, how highly do you actually rate Infinity War as a complete film? If this deeper look gave you another way into the movie, you can like the video and subscribe to Cinema Deep View for more film analysis built around what the story is doing beneath the surface. The first viewing gives us the battle. The deeper view reveals something less comfortable. Infinity War is not really asking who has enough power to save the universe. It is asking what kind of person you become when saving it demands a cost, and whether having the strength to impose that cost ever gives you the moral right to choose it for someone else. Cinema Deep View, look closer, and the movie changes.